Hi there, and welcome to the next series session entitled Recognizing Anger. Just a reminder that today's presentation is brought to you by Health Promotion 8-Wing CFB Trenton. This slide suggests our 8 table of contents that we're going to cover today. We're going to look at things such as definitions, some descriptions, some recognitions. We're going to take a look at trigger and coping thoughts, some mental fitness and positive coping techniques, and we'll definitely list some resources available to you on the topic. So without further ado, we'll get into some of the definitions. The first one is that of the topic of anger. So it's important to recognize that that's a strong emotion oriented towards a real or perceived grievance. And that grievance could be in the past, the present, or something somebody is worried about in the future. It could definitely be directed at the self or others. And it is an important state of emotion to recognize. It can vary in intensity, duration, and frequency, and it definitely has an impact on the body. The next definition to cover off is that of aggression. So aggression is behavior with an intention to do harm to someone, whether the harm results or not, or it's a behavior with willful blindness as to whether harm might result. So aggression is something that we don't recognize as a positive thing, because really important there, intention to do harm. Submissive behavior, you've probably heard of the doormat response. So when somebody allows others to take control and violate your rights, you end up feeling bullied or walked all over. So submissive behavior, when we're taking a look at definitions, it's important to frame it in the scope of all of these ones we've covered so far. So anger, aggression, and now submissive behavior. Assertiveness. So an assertive person will respect others, focus on the problem solving or resolving a conflict. There's no harm intended here. So very different than the aggressive definition. The assertive person is one that, yes, we would regard as a positive thing. Being assertive is stating what your experience is, what you want, in a way that is respectful of others. So getting what you want, yes, but respect is key. The difference with aggression, there is no respect. There's an intention to do harm. You may, in fact, get what you want, but not positively. So assertion or assertiveness is a positive quality. So the question on this next slide talks about why do we get angry? So it's important to understand that there's many reasons that could trigger someone to get angry. It could be a response to a perceived threat, to people, to things or ideas that are important to you. It could be about unmet expectations or maybe a perceived injustice. Maybe you witnessed something that you felt was extremely unfair and your emotional reaction to that was met with anger. It could be frustration of your goals. You could feel hurt or embarrassed or humiliated. It could be about harassment. There could be a personal attack, whether that's mental or physical. And those are all some of the most popular reasons why people get angry. Really important to recognize. This next slide is a quote from Aristotle, and it talks about anybody can become angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person to the right degree at the right time for the right purpose and in the right way, that's not easy. So Aristotle reminds us that anger is easy. You can probably think of lots of negative impacts of anger, but at this time you can also probably think of some positive results of anger. So the one that comes to mind in Canada, we have Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, and the title of that particular campaign initiative is MAD. So obviously the play on the acronym Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, it probably took someone to get mad or angry to stand up an extremely important cause against drunk driving. So there would be an example of becoming angry for the right reason, for the right purpose, and in a right way. So anger becomes a problem, and this slide lists many different options that come to mind. So when it becomes your main response to certain people, so then you're going to recognize that anger's become a problem. If it's your main response to most people and situations, anger's become a problem. If it's too intense or it lasts too long or it occurs in inappropriate situations, perhaps it has a negative impact on relationships, it might lead to aggression. These are all signals that anger has become a problem. As mentioned, there are some constructive functions of anger. So constructive versus destructive. So sometimes you see that energy might be created to resolve something, whether that's a conflict, maybe accomplish a task, right or wrong. A constructive function of anger might be to persevere in the face of frustration or an injustice. Maybe it allows you to activate psychological resources like determination, and definitely it allows you to protect your self-esteem. Some destructive functions of anger is listed on the slide there. When it triggers aggressive behavior, when you become somebody who ruminates over something or the situation, there's a potential to damage important relationships. It might trigger other distressing emotions such as sadness, fear, disappointment. It could lead to a loss of respect from others, and certainly there's a negative impact on physical and mental health. So, really important to recognize that not all functions of anger are negative. In some cases, there are constructive functions, but also the destructive function, probably bringing the attention to the important relationships, to the physical and mental health, to the self respect, to the sadness, fear, etc. So really important to recognize both functions. So this slide talks about the impact of anger on health. You're going to see a bunch of different things listed there. I draw your attention to the impairment of the immune system. So when we react to a situation with emotions such as anger, we are at risk now to shut down our immune capabilities. And then with that, we see increased levels of cortisol. Maybe if we're somebody who suffers from chronic pain, we'll see an intensity increase there. Perhaps there could be an increased risk from cardiovascular disease. One of the big health concerns that Canadians face, and certainly the stress piece, the anger piece, is a number one risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And then the last item there talks about the increased risk for anxiety and depression. So the benefit of this slide is to provide us with an awareness that health and anger are important things to consider. That when we have the impact of anger for a prolonged period of time, and if that is what is our go-to as far as reacting to certain situations, that there is a potential for a long-term negative impact on our health. And no secret that there's a connection between anger and stress. So anger is an emotional signal that lets us know that something has stressed us out, whether that's internally or externally, whether that's a good stress or a bad stress. So that part alone is important. This slide also highlights some definitions of stress and stressor. So the definition of stress, that's that condition or feeling that you experience when a person perceives that your demands have exceeded your resources. Lots of different ways to explain what stress can be defined as, but really important to recognize that there's an imbalance of resources based on the demand and your capability to mobilize those resources. It's also important to note the definition of stressor. So an event or a situation where the demands have exceeded the personal and social resources. So the stressor is the event or situation, and it's also really important to recognize that those stressors sometimes are internal. I might say something to myself that causes myself stress, or the phone might ring externally. I may get a phone call that event or situation may in fact present the stressful response. Another really important definition is that of mental fitness. We talk a lot about mental fitness and physical fitness for that matter in the CAF, and it's important to recognize the partnership that mental and physical fitness have. So this definition talks about mental fitness being a state of well-being, a state of mental health, where we're psychologically and we're emotionally resilient. We're able to bounce back or spring back after struggling through difficult and stressful times in our life. And then in some cases, not only will we be able to move forward, but we might grow and develop from this skill of mental fitness. And this is something that we don't want to take for granted. There'll be times in our life where we're more mentally fit or more mentally agile than others, but this is something just like physical fitness that we should be practicing, that we should be scheduling, that we should be performing mental fitness activities every day, just like we should be performing physical fitness activities every day, so we're capable of the rigors placed upon us. And in this case, those rigors are mental, but certainly you can probably reflect on the physical rigors, which is why we train cardiovascularly, why we train our muscle groups, why we train our flexibility and our range of motion. So important to recognize the partnership with physical fitness. But right now, with this discussion on anger, we're going to look at where mental fitness fits in. So recognizing when we're angry and where that falls on the mental health continuum. Everybody's probably seen this continuum, this model that conceptualizes our mental fitness from green over to red into ill. And you're going to see where anger presents itself on this particular continuum model. So in the green, when we're healthy, we don't see the anger piece there. But we do start to see it when we hit the reacting, injured, and ill. And you're going to see in the reacting phase, you're seeing the irritable, impatient, nervous, sadness, overwhelmed, turning into anger, anxiety, sad, hopelessness. And then when you hit the red, angry outbursts, aggression, excessive anxiety, panic attacks, the anger certainly has a larger play in the red, but certainly recognizing that the minute we are reacting in this mental health continuum model, we start to see a change in our mood fluctuations, and recognizing that anger fits into that section of the continuum, you're starting to see the change from sadness, overwhelming, to anger, anxiety, and then angry. So really important to recognize where it falls on this important continuum model. So we're going to talk about how stress happens. And it's usually a 3-stage process. There's that event that occurs, whether it's external or internal. This, in fact, is a car accident. So there would be an example of an external stress event. The second phase is where we interpret, we judge, we draw a conclusion of what's just happened. And then we have the third part of this process where we either head to the red, where we don't manage the stress and our response becomes anger, or we work with our resources, our skills, our experience, our tools to work through it into the green and stay in the green by managing the stress. So we have choices here after the stress happens. We have the choice in the interpretation judgment phase as to whether or not we are going to work through it and not allow anger to be the response, but in fact to work to understand how we can manage the stress that's just occurred. This next slide talks about the thinking skills model. So we just saw how stress happens in a 3-stage process: the event, the interpretation, and then ultimately the result. This, in fact, takes the situation or the event. It now applies all of our thoughts, our physical sensations, our emotions, so the interpretation and the judgment, and then it shows us, so it's basically expanded the 3-stage process into 5 considerations, because now we are taking a look at our five senses, how we feel, how we think, the cues that we may have in our body, the feelings, the anger, the sadness, the fear, the happiness, and then ultimately we get to look at the behavior, number 5. So this just takes a broader look at the complexity of the 3-stage process to how stress happens. We've expanded it and we have weighed in all sorts of other factors that we should consider as we think through a stressful situation. It's important to recognize that there are stages to anger mountain. So let's say we have an angry response to a situation. And let's say based on that thinking skills model, we do become angry. We do interpret and judge the situation and we react with emotion. And that emotion is an angry response. Well, there are 5 stages to that angry response. And this slide highlights that. So there's the trigger phase. So something's happened. Some stressful event has happened. We perhaps escalate through the anger phase. We get into a bit of a crisis phase where, in fact, things are really, really negative. And after the crisis, we move through, as you can see on the slide, the 4 and 5, the cool down and the depression. It's often noted that by the time somebody has had that angry response and they hit the 5th stage of what we call anger mountain, that they in fact really don't have a total picture on how they got to number 5. The trigger took place and then things just became very complex. The escalation in the crisis, we stop being able to think properly, we stop being able to make great choices, and then by the time, as mentioned, we get to number 5, the depression, we have no idea how it became so bad. So it's really important that when we see that 3-stage response to stress, the event, the interpretation, and then how we manage it, that when we're interpreting a stressful situation, we are mindful of how quickly anger can be triggered and how quickly it can change the behavior and the pattern that we are going to take to the situation. So anger mountain, you can probably think of a time, maybe reflect on a situation where you did become angry. What was the trigger? What did the escalation feel like? When you got to the crisis mode, were you able to think clearly? Did you make the best decisions? Did you say the right things? And then when it was all said and done, was that full of regret? Was that unclear as to how quickly that all escalated for you? Just an opportunity to reflect on any time in your past that you have reacted with anger. And this slide depicts how important it is to work to control the emotional response to a stressful situation, because it very quickly, as you can see on the slide, it increases to a peak, and then it very quickly, as you can see on the slide, decreases to the depression. And there can be a lot of very negative things that take place between the trigger and the depression. So what are some of these trigger thoughts that in fact could escalate somebody's emotions, their physical sensations, and that in fact create that response to the stressful situation that's about anger? So, for example, this slide depicts a few of the common trigger thoughts: that somebody was ignored, that you're sick of having to tell the person over and over again to turn off the TV. Maybe you have this feeling that they have disrespected you again. Those would be examples of trigger thoughts. And when you're considering a stressful situation and how quickly your anger can escalate, it's important to recognize what our trigger thoughts are doing to contribute to the angry response that we might be having. And once we recognize some of our trigger thoughts, like what does throw us off in a stressful situation that would make us think a certain way, feel a certain way, and then we act on that, and maybe we should recognize that that trigger thought is an error in our thinking, and we need to use a coping thought to get through that. So the beauty of a coping thought is that it can de-escalate our emotions. Physiologically, our sensations can be controlled, our actions can be controlled, and these coping thoughts allow for a calm response to a stressful situation. So I'm going to give you an example of a trigger thought. You're driving home from work, it's the summertime, it's Friday afternoon, and you have somebody driving in front of you at a very slow pace. And let's say the speed limit is about 60 kilometers an hour on this road that's your road to getting home and starting your weekend. And you're in fact seeing this person going probably about 30 kilometers an hour. So the stressful situation is that the person in front of you is driving extremely slowly, not the speed limit. Your trigger thought is, and it could be different for everybody, like, what is wrong with this person? Why are they driving so slowly? Sometimes an example of a trigger thought might be, oh, they must be a new driver, or oh, they must be an old driver. And then we start to ruminate in our mind about all these very negative interpretations of what's just happened. And in fact, this is where we should use a coping thought. So a coping thought for maybe somebody not driving well in front of you is maybe they are a new driver and they're not sure of this road, or they've never driven on this road before, or they're just taking their time and being extra cautious. Maybe they are an older person and they in fact aren't in a rush like we are because they don't work and we're trying to get home on a Friday afternoon and start our weekend. So a coping thought in actual fact could be a way to control the stressful response with anger to a situation that we really don't have any control over. The person's driving pattern in front of you, some of what you may be experiencing could also be based on the things you're telling yourself about the situation. So, great opportunity to use a coping thought to modify the trigger or the escalation of your emotions of the thought that you may have had that wasn't positive, and it was contributing to how you were feeling in the situation. So the following slide takes a look at ways to cope. We want to take time before you deal with a situation. You want to talk to somebody that you're not angry with. So let's say you have a stressful situation. Think of a previous situation and how you might learn from that for next time on ways to cope to prevent the angry response. Making sure that you take the opportunity to, as we talked about, our mental fitness, but our physical fitness, learn how to walk away from a stressful situation or a stressful conversation. Maybe distract yourself. Maybe you're overhearing a very frustrating conversation at work, and that's causing you some internal stress. Maybe you distract yourself, close your door, turn on some music, maybe dive into the work and just try to tune out what you're hearing. Sometimes humor is a great way to cope. So trying to find the light in it all, trying to find a more lighthearted approach to what you're dealing with. So practice some relaxation skills, and sometimes just counting to 10 to try to de-escalate, and or in this case, maybe even use a coping thought while you're counting to 10 to try to cope through an angry or stressful situation. It's important to remember as we're dealing with stress and we're trying to manage our anger as a response to a stressful situation that there are lots of resources available to us. There's CFMAP, there's Canada Suicide Hotline, all sorts of information. Maybe the coronavirus pandemic situation is something that's causing us a ton of stress and making us angry with all the restrictions, with all the changes in our life. Maybe it's an opportunity for you to read up on things so you can use some coping thoughts instead of those triggers. There's the Family Information Line. There's the SMRC, Kids Helpline. And you can probably think of many other resources that are available. You should have a great network of people you can speak to. But if in fact it becomes more serious and you need to reach out to a practitioner, this slide reminds us of a few of those phone numbers or resources to reach out to. It's important to recognize that consistent response of anger could be a symptom of a bigger problem, and it could be that mentally you might be struggling. So a reminder to the mental health continuum model, if anger is your response to everything, then it might be an opportunity to reflect on what is it that you should reach out as far as resources for. What is it that is causing you to respond with anger to every situation or a stressful situation? We want to also take the opportunity to remind you of the importance of all your mental fitness techniques. So when you're dealing with stress, of course, one of the most popular techniques is a breathing technique, which is whether it's meditation or it's 4-count breathing, or if it's a purposeful breath control where you're speaking to yourself and trying to slow your breathing down. That's one example, but we also know that there's grounding techniques, there's positive self-talk, there's that coping thought tool, there's the situationally awareness piece, to be mindful when you're in stressful situations on what you're feeling, what you're experiencing. But in health promotion, we are always reminded how important our breathing is to a stressful situation. It can help control the response to the stress by controlling the breathing and by bringing you out of that crisis or escalation phase of anger mountain, one of the previous slides. So breathing is a great resource, but this is also an opportunity to take a look at how you do deal with stress. Are there things that can help you when you've had a stressful day, when you've had a stressful week? Maybe you're going through a stressful month. Maybe it's a period of work that is always stressful. Maybe there's something happening personally. What are your resources? As the slide suggests, we think breathing is important, but there's a ton of resources available to us when we consider the things that can help us on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to make sure we're staying in the green, to make sure we're staying in the mental health continuum model where we're healthy and our mood is stable. It's not to say that we're never going to experience stress, and it's not to say we're never going to experience anger. But as that one slide suggested, Aristotle said, to be angry at the right time, to the right degree, at the right person, for the right reason. That's the constructive form of anger, and recognizing how destructive anger can be. So back to the basics as far as our stress management tools. Thank you for tuning in today on managing anger and just being reflective on previous experiences that you may have had with anger. On behalf of Health Promotion, have a great month, and don't forget to continue to practice your breathing in every aspect of your life, not just the stress management piece, but at the end of the day, maybe the beginning of the day, not only after a stressful week, but maybe even after a great week. Our breathing, our meditation, our breathing techniques, when we do this on purpose, and we allow that reflection piece, that is a great tool to the relaxation response that we're all aspiring to achieve so that stress is not a factor. Thank you.